Well, I actually think that one of the initial kind of impetuses behind the book was that partition has made a reappearance in recent years as a potential quote unquote solution for all kinds of ethnic conflict in widely varied places, right? And that's an alarming development because it suggests to a public that partition is a kind of neutral tactic of state making and a neutral tactic of what's being called conflict resolution, and one where it is possible to identify and separate people of different nationalities, different religions, different languages with ease, and resulting in kind of clear-cut borders that will that represent more viable states, right? So there have been all kinds of proposals for this in places like Iraq and Syria. It's ongoing for Palestine, Israel. We've had a recent partition of similar nature in the Sudan, right? So there's a renewed internationalist interest in the idea of partition as a kind of tactic of state making and peacemaking. And I think that our research is really challenging the emergence of that idea, the reemergence of that idea, by saying we need to look here, first of all, at what the actual goals of these partitions were, that they are not, in fact, about the making of nation states from the bottom up, but rather about the maintenance of imperial and internationalist control from the top down. So it suggests a kind of different set of goals for those practices. But also, I think it emphasizes the actual mechanics, which are mechanics of violence. When we think about what does it require to draw a new border, to create two nation states where we had a multinational state previously of whatever nature, what does that require? It requires expulsions. It requires violence. It requires physical movement, removal of entire populations. And it requires people to self-define into communities that they may or may not have any particular sympathy with. So I think that is also a really, really important corrective that we need to understand, that partition has historically and continues to be today, has been a violent process.
I think that this comeback also kind of illustrates something that we came up saying in the book, which is also one of the shifts in the perception of partition. When we think about partition as sort of a cutting exercise, and this is also how the previous scholarship tended to look at it, we would assume it was this moment which is short, brief, very painful. Surgical metaphors are always invoked in that context, in which you cut the land and even cut the people and in a very brutal and violent way. But that's it. It's end. Maybe there's a scar, but it's a closed event. And part of what happened in the politics of those so-called post-partition spaces is that partition exactly came back. I mean, reappeared, it resurfaced in each one of those spaces in a different time and due to different circumstances. In the South Asian context, for instance, partition was never a done deal. The partition of 1947 created two Pakistans: East Pakistan, that is now a different state, and also in the 1980s, the assassination of Indira Gandhi is often mentioned by scholars from India as a moment in which suddenly Indian intellectuals thought that, that partition that we thought is a closed business, the echoes and the ghosts are here, and they're resurfacing, and they're shaping our present. And not to mention, of course, the other contexts, Israel, Palestine, and not to mention Ireland today in the age of Brexit. So part of what is happening here is that when we start thinking about partition in this way, we realize that it's not an event, a clear cut. It's a process. And part of what makes partition so sinister in many respects is that it's a project that you're constantly busy, you're achieving it, exercising it. And in order to turn the theory into practice, you're continually shaping the post-partition political spaces through a lot of coercion and bureaucratic, legal, and violent mechanisms.
It's interesting. It relates in some ways to the scholarship on settler colonialism, right? The anthropologist Patrick Wolf famously had this line that said that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. There's not a moment when it's over. It has to be continuously reinforced. And the same is true for partition, that in order that it is an ongoing and unfolding process forever, that it is never a closed event.
Mm-hmm.